In March 2015, Singapore fell silent. Its streets were busy as always, its economy running like clockwork. But the heart of the nation was somewhere else, inside a hospital room where its founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, was living his final days. For most Singaporeans, Lee was not just a leader. He was the man who had turned a tiny, vulnerable island with no natural resources into one of the richest, safest, and most respected countries on earth. He was strict, sometimes feared, but deeply respected. His life was so tied to the fate of Singapore that people often said, "When Lee goes, will Singapore survive?" As news spread that Lee was in critical condition, people of all ages, from school children to elderly uncles sipping kopi at hawker centers, felt the weight of history pressing down. The city that he built was preparing to say goodbye to the man who built it. This is the story of Lee Kuan Yew's final days and the extraordinary legacy he left behind. A story of how one man's vision shaped a nation and how his death became a moment of reflection for millions. Chapter 1. The Man Who Refused to Give Up. Lee Kuan Yew's story began long before those final hospital days. Born in 1923 in a Singapore still under British colonial rule, Lee grew up during a time when the island was just another small port in Southeast Asia, crowded, humid, and fragile. His family was not poor, but they lived modestly, and Lee's early years were shaped by uncertainty. The greatest test of his youth came during World War II, when Japanese troops invaded and occupied Singapore. Overnight, a bustling trading hub became a place of fear. Food was scarce, people whispered in hushed tones, and survival meant keeping your head down. Lee himself narrowly escaped death when he was almost taken away during a military roundup of young Chinese men. That brush with mortality left a scar on his memory and a conviction that only strength, order, and discipline could protect the people from being trampled. After the war, Lee pursued education with relentless drive. He studied law at Cambridge University, graduated with top honors, and returned determined to fight for Singapore's future. In 1959, when Singapore achieved self-government, Lee became its first prime minister at just 35 years old. But the young leader inherited what many believed was a hopeless case. The island had no oil, no gold, not even fresh water of its own. It was a swampy, overcrowded trading post, plagued with slums, unemployment, and crime. On top of that, it was surrounded by larger, often hostile neighbors. To many outsiders, Singapore looked like a country destined to fail, nothing more than a poor little red dot on the map. Lee refused to accept that destiny. With a sharp mind and iron will, he set out to build a nation from scratch. He invited foreign investors to set up industries, but demanded high standards of honesty and efficiency. He cracked down on corruption, insisting that leaders must be clean if they expected citizens to follow. He emphasized education, believing that Singapore's only resource was its people's brainpower. Critics accused him of being authoritarian. Admirers called him brilliant. But even his harshest critics could not deny the results. In just one generation, Singapore went from mudflats and malaria to skyscrapers, safe streets, and one of the world's best airports. So when Lee grew old and frail, Singaporeans did not see him merely as an elderly man. They saw him as the living pillar of the nation, the man who refused to give up when everyone else said it was impossible. That made his final days not just personal, but profoundly national. Chapter 2. The Hospital Vigil. In February 2015, Singaporeans received the news they had long dreaded. Lee Kuan Yew had been admitted to Singapore General Hospital. He was 91 years old and suffering from severe pneumonia, a dangerous illness for someone of such age. The government released official statements, but the language was careful, almost heavy. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. This was serious. As days passed, the atmosphere outside the hospital began to change. At first, only a few people came to stand quietly outside, but soon, crowds gathered. They brought flowers and handwritten notes. Some bowed their heads in prayer, others stood silently as though keeping watch. In a country where public displays of emotion were rare and often discouraged, Singaporeans now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by worry for the man who had once united them in survival. The updates from the government were always brief. Mr. Lee remains critically ill. Nothing more. But those short sentences carried enormous weight. Each announcement was shared on television, in newspapers, and across smartphones. At coffee shops and hawk centers, conversations stopped when the news played. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in sorrow. For the younger generation, this was the first time they truly felt the possibility of losing him. They had only known the prosperous Singapore he built, not the struggling, fragile country of the past. For the older generation, who remembered the chaotic years before independence, it felt like watching a parent fade away. A parent who had sacrificed everything to keep the family alive. Inside the hospital, his children and grandchildren kept vigil. His son, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, bore the heaviest burden. By day, he led the government and kept the nation calm. By night, he was a son sitting by his father's bedside, watching the man who had once been unshakable grow weaker with each passing hour. By mid-March, the tone of the medical reports left little hope. Singaporeans sensed the inevitable. Many described it as a quiet heaviness that fell over the island. The streets were still busy, life carried on, but beneath it all, the people were waiting. The man who had once stood like a lion, fearless, unyielding, larger than life, was slipping away, and Singapore, for the first time in decades, felt vulnerable. Chapter 3. The announcement on March 23, 2015, at exactly 3:18 a.m., Singapore's founding father breathed his last breath at Singapore General Hospital. After weeks of waiting and watching, the moment had finally come. The man who had carried a small, fragile nation on his shoulders for half a century was gone. The official announcement came a few hours later. At dawn, the Prime Minister's office released the statement to the nation. Across the island, radios, television sets, and mobile phones carried the same words. Lee Kuan Yew had passed away. The effect was immediate. Singaporeans woke up to the news with tears in their eyes. Some wept openly, others sat in silence, unable to speak. Television stations turned their screens to black and white, a somber reminder of the nation's loss. Flags across the island flew at half-mast. Government buildings, schools, and even private companies lowered their flags in respect. For many, it felt as though time itself had stopped. But the reaction was more than just grief, it was gratitude. At offices, construction sites, classrooms, and shopping malls, people paused to reflect. Ordinary Singaporeans began talking not only about his passing, but about their own lives. They remembered how he had given them clean water, affordable homes, safe streets, and jobs in a thriving economy. The orderly, prosperous Singapore they lived in was his creation, and in their sorrow, many felt a deep thankfulness. Messages of condolence poured in from across the world. Former U.S. President Barack Obama called him a giant of history who guided Singapore from poverty to prosperity. China's President Xi Jinping praised his wisdom. India's Narendra Modi honored him as a visionary. Japan's Shinzo Abe described him as a leader respected far beyond his shores. Leaders everywhere agreed Lee Kuan Yew was more than Singapore's prime minister. He was a global statesman, a mentor, and a strategist who had influenced world affairs for decades. For 1 week, Singapore entered a period of national mourning. Black ribbons appeared on websites, newspapers, and even social media profiles. But the week was not only filled with sadness. It became a week of remembering, of storytelling, of honoring the man whose life was so deeply intertwined with the destiny of a nation. Chapter 4. The queue that stretched for miles. During the week of mourning, Lee Kuan Yew's body was placed in Parliament House, the very place where he had once thundered with speeches and shaped the future of Singapore. The doors were opened, and Singaporeans were invited to pay their last respects. But nobody expected what happened next. The queue stretched endlessly. It wound through bridges, underpasses, and across roads. Families stood side by side, holding umbrellas under the blazing tropical sun. Some waited through the night, others braved sudden downpours. Many queued for as long as 8 to 10 hours, just for a few fleeting seconds to walk past his coffin and bow their heads. By the end of the week, over 1.2 million people, nearly 1 in every 4 Singaporeans, had come. Old and young, rich and poor, native-born citizens and migrant workers, all stood in the same line, united in grief and respect. Elderly aunties wept quietly, remembering the early days when Lee had given them affordable homes. Young children, too young to understand fully, were guided by their parents to bow their heads before his casket. Foreign workers, men who had laid bricks for the nation's skyscrapers, waited patiently, saying with simple honesty, "Without him, this city would not exist. Without him, we would not have these jobs." It was not just the death of a leader. It was the weight of shared history. As Singaporeans stood in line, memories filled the air. They remembered how Lee fought corruption when it was everywhere, how he demanded honesty from politicians, how he emphasized education so that even a poor child from a kampong could dream of becoming a doctor, engineer, or prime minister. And perhaps most striking of all was the discipline of the crowd. There was no chaos, no shouting, no pushing. The lines were orderly, calm, and respectful. Volunteers passed out water bottles. Soldiers and policemen guided the flow with quiet efficiency. Even in mourning, Singapore reflected the values Lee had instilled: discipline, patience, and respect for one another. The queue became more than a line of people. It became a living symbol of his legacy. Every step forward was a step of gratitude, a reminder that one man's vision had given millions a nation to be proud of. Chapter 5. The Rain at the Funeral. On March 29, 2015, Singapore held a state funeral for its founding father. It was the kind of day that would be remembered for generations. From early morning, roads were sealed off, security tightened, and cameras positioned along the procession route. World leaders poured in: Bill Clinton, Henry Kissinger, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and many others. They had come not only to honor Lee Kuan Yew, but to pay tribute to the leader who had earned global respect for turning a vulnerable island into an international powerhouse. Inside the University Cultural Center, the official ceremony was solemn. The eulogies were moving, each recalling Lee's vision, his discipline, and his unwavering commitment to his people. But outside, in the streets of Singapore, the most powerful tribute was unfolding, not from presidents or dignitaries, but from ordinary citizens. As the funeral procession began its journey through the city, dark clouds gathered. Soon, heavy rain poured down. In Singaporean culture, rain at a funeral is not seen as misfortune, but as a blessing, a final farewell from the heavens. Many believed it was nature's way of honoring Lee Kuan Yew one last time. Tens of thousands lined the streets despite the downpour. Some held umbrellas, but many let the rain drench them. They waved flags, sang the national anthem, and shouted his name: Lee Kuan Yew, Lee Kuan Yew. The voices were not cries of despair, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the homes they lived in, the jobs they held, the safe city they walked through at night. When the military fired the 21-gun salute, the thunderous echoes rolled across the island. Naval vessels at sea gave a final horn blast, and fighter jets roared overhead in a last flypast. For a moment, it felt as if the entire nation stopped breathing, united in silence. Soaked in rain and tears, Singapore said goodbye to its founding father. It was not just the end of a life, it was the closing of a chapter in history. A farewell marked by dignity, gratitude, and a sky that wept with the people. Chapter 6. The legacy he left. Lee Kuan Yew's passing closed a historic chapter, but his fingerprints remain everywhere in Singapore. His legacy is not confined to statues or memorials, it lives in the everyday lives of Singaporeans. Clean government. One of his greatest achievements was eradicating corruption. In the 1960s, corruption was common across Asia. Bribes, favoritism, and abuse of power were the norm. But Lee took a hard stand. He gave ministers and civil servants competitive salaries, removing the temptation to earn on the side. In exchange, he demanded absolute integrity. The penalty for corruption was swift and severe, no matter who you were. Today, Singapore is consistently ranked among the least corrupt nations in the world. Its clean government is not an accident, it is Lee's legacy. Housing for all. Lee also knew that stability began with a roof over people's heads. He created the Housing and Development Board (HDB), which transformed slums into modern apartments. Entire families who once lived in overcrowded wooden shacks were given safe, affordable homes with electricity, clean water, and sanitation. Today, more than 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats, a unique model of home ownership that gave ordinary citizens dignity and a sense of belonging. Education as a resource. Singapore had no oil, no gold, and not even fresh water of its own. Lee understood that the only resource was human talent. He poured money and energy into education, making schools rigorous, bilingual, and focused on science and technology. Generations of engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, and innovators came from this system. It is why Singapore's workforce is still regarded as one of the best trained in the world. Discipline and order. Lee believed discipline was essential for survival. From strict laws against littering to tough punishments for crime, he built a culture of order. Foreigners sometimes mocked the nanny state, but Singaporeans knew that those laws created safety and pride. It became one of the cleanest and safest countries on earth, where parents felt comfortable letting their children play outside and workers could walk home at midnight without fear. Global influence. Perhaps most remarkably, Lee showed that size does not define destiny. With only 5 million people, Singapore became a respected voice in global politics. Leaders from China, the US, India, and beyond studied Lee's model of governance, calling him both a mentor and a strategist. Of course, his critics pointed to limits on press freedom and political opposition. Yet even many of them admitted, without his iron will, Singapore might not have survived its early years. Today, every visitor who lands at Changi Airport, every foreign company that sets up in Singapore, and every Singaporean family living in safety is living proof of Lee Kuan Yew's vision, a legacy as alive as the city itself. Chapter 7. The man behind the power. Behind the sharp speeches, the firm handshakes, and the reputation of being a no-nonsense statesman, there was another side to Lee Kuan Yew, a deeply human side that fewer people saw. He was, first and foremost, a devoted husband. His marriage to Kwok Chu, his Cambridge-educated partner in both intellect and love, lasted for more than 6 decades. She was his closest confidant, the one he trusted most in moments of doubt. Friends often said that when Lee was unsure of a decision, he would discuss it with her late into the night. When she passed away in 2010, the loss cut him deeply. For a man known for his iron will, his grief revealed a softer vulnerability. In an interview, he quietly admitted that he wished he could join her soon, a rare glimpse into the private sorrow of a man who had always stood so strong in public. He was also a father who believed in raising children not with luxury, but with discipline and responsibility. He never allowed them to take his position for granted. His son, Lee Hsien Loong, would eventually become prime minister, but only after proving himself through years of service. To Lee, family ties did not excuse anyone from the hard work of excellence. Even in his later years, when his health weakened, Lee remained engaged with his nation's daily life. He was known to walk through gardens, inspecting trees and flowers, making sure they were planted properly. Some thought it obsessive, but to him, details mattered. A clean street, a properly trimmed tree, or a well-maintained park was not cosmetic, it was a reflection of discipline and pride. Above all, Lee believed in the potential of his people. He often said that Singaporeans could be as tough, as smart, and as capable as anyone in the world. He lived his life, proving that belief true not just with policies, but with personal conviction. Behind the power, there was a husband, a father, and a man who loved his nation with the same devotion he gave to his family. Chapter 8. What his death means today. 10 years after his passing, Singapore is still unmistakably shaped by Lee Kuan Yew's vision. The housing blocks, the spotless streets, the orderly MRT stations, the gleaming financial district all carry his imprint. His policies built not just a city, but a national identity. Yet his death also left questions that continue to echo. Can Singapore survive without him watching from above? Will future leaders have the same steel, the same uncompromising honesty and discipline? Or will the comforts of prosperity soften the nation into complacency? For the older generation, the answer feels clear. Singapore must hold firmly to his values of discipline, hard work, and incorruptibility. They lived through the poverty of the 1950s, the uncertainty of separation from Malaysia, and the threats of racial unrest. To them, Lee was not just a leader, he was the shield that kept chaos at bay. For younger Singaporeans, however, the picture looks more complex. They never saw slums or unemployment riots. They only know a Singapore of world-class airports, safe neighborhoods, and endless opportunities. While they admire Lee's achievements, they also long for more freedom, open debate, and a political system that feels less rigid. Their challenge is finding balance, preserving Lee's foundation while allowing new ideas and openness to flourish in a changing world. The test of his legacy lies in this transition. Can Singapore remain disciplined without being harsh? Can it stay globally competitive while also giving space for creativity and dissent? These are questions Lee himself wrestled with, and now they belong to the next generation. But one thing is beyond doubt. Lee Kuan Yew's name will never fade. His legacy is etched not just in history books, but in the everyday life of Singaporeans. The skyline of Marina Bay, the efficiency of Changi Airport, the trust in government institutions, the safety of walking home at midnight, all of these are monuments to his vision. Even without his physical presence, his spirit lingers. Every time Singapore faces a new challenge, be it global competition, climate change, or social change, his example stands as a reminder. Survival comes from discipline, unity, and courage. Lee Kuan Yew is gone, but Singapore itself is his living legacy. Conclusion: the father of a nation. The final days of Lee Kuan Yew were filled with sorrow, but they were also filled with unity. For 1 week, Singaporeans stood shoulder to shoulder, not divided by politics, wealth, or race, but bound by respect and gratitude for the man who had given them a nation. His funeral was not just for a man, it was for an era. It marked the closing of a chapter that began in poverty and fear and ended in prosperity and pride. It was a farewell to the journey from slums and malaria to skyscrapers and world-class hospitals, from a vulnerable red dot to a nation respected across the globe. Today, when Singaporeans look at their city, they see Lee Kuan Yew's fingerprints everywhere. They see it in the neat rows of HDB flats that provide homes for millions. They see it in the clean tap water that once had to be imported. They see it in the world-class schools and universities that nurture future generations. They see it in the safety of their streets, where even at midnight, children can walk without fear. The world remembers him as a giant of history, a strategist admired by presidents and prime ministers. But Singapore remembers him more personally as a father. A father who was sometimes strict, sometimes uncompromising, but always determined to protect and provide. And so the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew lives on not merely in books or speeches, but in every heartbeat of the nation he built. His story is not just Singapore's past, it is Singapore's living present and its future.